Agradezco a usted sus palabras, agradezco a usted su disertación y le vamos a hacer algunas preguntas tal como es habitual en nuestra casa y no sé si usted prefiere que le hagan todas las preguntas juntas o bien que responder a cada una de las preguntas.
No, I think we can do one by one. It's not a large crowd, okay. So we can...
Perfecto.
But I'll leave you to moderate and choose who...
Adelante, señor embajador.
Thank you very much. And first, thank you, gracias. First of all, if I might say, through you, Madam Chair, to Aman for that excellent presentation, most refreshing and very well put. And also thank you for bearing witness for those of us who've been watching the Arab Spring on television. I think you've done a commendably impressive job. I'd like to ask you a question, and you just touched on it, on Egypt's new relationship with Israel, particularly because you also mentioned in our discussion that you're about to go to the United Nations from here. And we know what's going to happen. The United States is going to veto the statehood proposal of Palestine, and the General Assembly is going to approve some kind of uprating of the status of Palestine in the General Assembly. But the consequence of that, not just in the Middle East, but particularly in Egypt, which has arguably the most significant Arab world relationship and the most essential one with Israel. Where do you see that going? What do you prognosticate on those lines? We've obviously watched from here the events around the Israeli embassy in Cairo last week, or the week before, and I'd really be very interested to learn your thoughts on the road ahead of that relationship.
Sure, I think one thing I can say with a great deal of confidence is the headlines on every Arab newspaper the morning after the UN Security Council vote is going to say U.S. vetoes Palestinian statehood. And this is a tremendous diplomatic challenge for the United States to overcome. It's not going to say the UN vetoes or the UN blocks Palestinian statehood. It's not going to say Palestinian statehood denied. It's going to say the US vetoes Palestinian statehood. So the reason why I'm starting from that particular point is because for the past, as I was saying, 30 years, even longer, the United States has suffered a credibility problem in the Arab world. It has backed so many of these regimes at the expense of the values that it says it's practicing. So in the past 6 months, there has been a sliver of hope that some of American foreign policy towards the Middle East can change. Some were very optimistic that the US was very vocal with the NATO campaign in Libya, that it helped galvanize European action. Others have praised some of the American comments in the final days of the Mubarak regime, that it came out and said that Mubarak must lead a transition. So there was a hope that the United States was going to change some of its policies, particularly when it came to the issues of freedom. And unfortunately, the headline in the Arab world the morning after this vote is going to set that back. So that's one. Two, I think for 30 years, the world has been lied to by the Egyptian regime that there was a genuine peace that existed between Israel and Egypt. I think that, you know, in the words of Martin Luther King, genuine peace is not the absence of violence. It's the presence of social justice. And if there's one thing that many of you have seen, is that there has been no justice in the Arab world for Arab citizens between any of the regimes. And even in this situation between Israel and Egypt, there has been no pursuit of genuine justice in terms of the foreign policies between the two countries. I think most recently this was highlighted with the killing of 5 Egyptian soldiers on the border. For years, these types of incidents that happened would be brushed aside, would be put under the table because the regime was dealing with a country on a strategic level, and that's it. That was a matter of fact. Nobody could speak up against that. Nobody can raise these issues. Well, what is happening today in Egypt is that the people are demanding a foreign policy that reflects the will of the majority. And sadly, the will of the majority in this particular climate is not one favorable towards Israel and towards the United States, particularly when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And it's going to be very challenging, both on the Israeli government and on the Egyptian government, to make a compelling case for peace. And that's what they have to do. They now have to not only sell the peace to the countries of the world, they have to sell it to their own people. And I think this begins by showing the people, well, what is each government, what is each society really doing to advocate a genuine peace between Egypt and Israel. So I think that the situation, particularly vis-a-vis Israel, in a few situations, I mean, Israel's relationship with Turkey has deteriorated. The Israeli-Palestinian situation is in a complete deadlock. And the situation between Israel and Egypt is also deteriorating, and is going to require a paradigm shift in how the leaders of these countries look at the core issues of the conflict.
Gracias. El embajador, perdón, primero va a hacerle una pregunta el embajador Colombo Murúa y luego la realizará el embajador Molteni.
Thank you very much. I joined the ambassador in commending your presentation, which I think it was brilliant and yet very brief and clear. Thank you very much. My question is addressed to the internal situation in Egypt. What is the outlook at this time of the outcome of these processes? That is to say, constitutional amendments, legislative elections and presidential elections. Thank you very much.
The timeline was just announced a few days ago in terms of the transition, and it's already late. And when the military council assumed power on February 11th, the first thing they said was that the elections would take place within 6 months. Now that's clearly no longer on the timeline. They just announced that the first round of parliamentary, Egypt's upper and lower house, the first lower house elections, I believe, is November 21st, and then the upper house is January 22nd, which means that the presidential elections will at least be sometime between 60 to 90 days after January 22nd, because they said that the presidential elections would be less. So it will be at least more than a year since the end of the revolution before a genuine civilian government is in power to begin the reforms to change. The real challenge is that I think, particularly in Egypt, Egypt is not a country starting from zero. For example, in Libya, it's a country that had unions, it's a country that had syndicates, private universities, it had political parties, but these institutions were completely defunct. They were not functioning properly. They were all co-opted by the regime, hijacked by the regime. So the country itself has to refurbish all of these institutions and start from scratch in order to get the wheels of democracy and civil participation going. And that's an extremely daunting challenge. In some cases, Libya is actually more advanced than Egypt because they're starting from zero. So and it's hard to imagine, I know, but they're starting from zero in the sense that they're building everything from scratch. In Egypt, you have to deconstruct and then rebuild again, and that's going to take some time. I think it's naive for the Egyptian people to think that removing Mubarak alone was going to be the solution to their problems. And I think it's naive for the military to think that, oh, we've gotten rid of Mubarak, so the people now should be happy and should be quiet and stop protesting and stop demanding reforms. And it's really interesting because one of the first things I heard in the revolutions in Tunisia from one of the families was that we've removed the dictator, but we haven't removed the dictatorship. And I think the dictatorship is really the most difficult thing. How do you remove the dictatorship, which is a part of the culture in Egypt? It's every individual who pays a bribe to a policeman, it's every person who steals money from the local treasury in a small council, and these are the challenges that are facing the country. And many people are divided over how to do that. Do you rewrite the constitution first? Do you elect a parliament based on the old constitution and then have them rewrite a new constitution? And these are the challenges that nobody has come up with a very clear vision as to how to answer, as of yet.
Muchísimas gracias. El embajador Molteni, por favor.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I would like to ask you some small questions. The first one is how much has changed the relationship with Egypt with Iran, how much have changed with Saudi Arabia, how are the relations with Hamas right now, and also the last question, how important do you think that is the proportion of the Muslim Brotherhood in the next election? How much do you think that the proportion they will have?
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. I'll start with the last one and I'll work backwards. The Muslim Brotherhood, as you probably very well know, for 30 years was the largest opposition group in Egypt. It was illegal, it was banned, but it was the one opposition that had serious traction on the ground and the ability to mobilize people on the ground. So a great deal of its popularity was very much inflated. You know, when there is a genuine political atmosphere in Egypt where you have the Muslim Brotherhood, secular parties, progressive parties, liberal parties, socialist parties, people will have the choice and the freedom to make without consequence, and I think you will realize that the Muslim Brotherhood's weight in Egyptian politics was not as significant as everyone made it out to be. Because for a long time, the only support it had, if you didn't like the regime, you supported the Muslim Brotherhood, even if you ideologically are not in line with the Muslim Brotherhood. Because all of the other parties, they were under the control of the regime and essentially used as paper maches to show the world that we have a multi-party system in Egypt when it was really fake. So that's one. So I think if I put a number on it, the Muslim Brotherhood after the revolution said that they only wanted to compete for 1/3 of the seats of parliament. They then changed from 1/3 to 50%, that they said they were going to compete for 50% of the seats. And the reason why is because they realized that if they just compete for 1/3 of the seats, they'll probably end up with 10% of the seats. And so now they want to compete for 50% to probably get close to 25% and 30%. I think the challenge isn't going to be with whether the Muslim Brotherhood wins a significant majority, not majority, but a bloc. I think they will. The question is, what about the remaining 70%? Will the remaining 70% be more united, be organized, be a little bit more influential than what we've seen in the past? And this is the real challenge. In terms of the Egyptian relationship with Hamas, again, it's one of those relationships where on a people-to-people level, it's a very close relationship between the people of Gaza and the people of Egypt. Particularly, Egyptians see Hamas as a resistance movement. And the majority of Egyptians don't look at Hamas as posing a threat to the national security of Egypt. This was something that the former regime would always say, that the Mubarak regime would say Hamas poses a security threat to Egypt. This is something most Egyptians don't accept. So I think with a new elected civilian government, you will see a foreign policy that reflects more favorably in dealing with Hamas and not trying to isolate it or contain it in this way. The advantage of this is that if Egypt can build a genuine relationship with Hamas, it is probably the only country in the region that can convince Hamas in changing many of its tactics, many of its approaches. Because what we have seen is that when Egypt is a genuine partner in Palestinian reconciliation between Hamas and Fatah, they can impose very good influence on Hamas. But when it's a fake